Hi everyone, my name is Mike Downs, and today I'll be presenting my research on masculinity, guilt, and sustainable food literacy. This study looks at how masculinity norms might influence the way young men respond when they're asked to participate in sustainability focused food literacy research. I'll walk through the background, methods, findings, and what I learned through this process. The research question is what is going to be used to guide the study that I'm doing. How masculinity norms shape the guilt responses of young men when they're asked to participate in sustainability focused food literacy research. This question comes up because of the gaps I found during my literature review, and it shows that men participate less in food literacy efforts and also contribute more to environmentally impactful dietary patterns. So during my literature review, it became important for me to come across which key terms are going to be better defined during my study, so that way everyone has a shared sense of what those things mean. So young men will refer to early adult males, those who are assigned male at birth, between the ages of 18 and 30. Generally, they show lower food literacy scores. Masculinity refers to sociocultural expectations that shape how men think about food, health, and the way that they seek help around those things. Sustainability food literacy combines basic food skills with the understanding of how those choices can impact sustainability. And guilt refers to the stigma linked emotional response that's going to be influencing whether or not young men feel comfortable participating in food related research. So, my literature review covered a few different topics in order to help better inform how these topics can create a good understanding of the way I can approach the study design and better capture the details that I'm hoping to during its implementation. So during this literature review, I covered food literacy disparities, and those covered how males are consistently scoring lower in food literacy understandings and healthy eating assessments, and the way that those masculinity norms can impact their engagement, and how they may or may not want to participate in those things based on that engagement. Next, my literature review covered how gender differences in food literacy education can also lead to disparities in their understanding. So, males tend to be less confident and intentional about their food choices, despite having similar nutrition knowledge. And then, male diet preferences and body image concerns also have an impact on whether or not interventions are effective. So it was important for my literature review to help me understand the impact on health outcomes that having a disparity in health knowledge might have. And so food literacy can correlate to improved health incomes and improved food citizenship. And students that link their food choices often to their ability to be more attentive and their broader well being. So during my literature review, I also wanted to understand how those diet choices would impact not just individuals, but the broader population. And so male diets tend to have a larger contribution to environmental impacts. And some of that was actually through beef consumption. And sustainable food literacy connected those ideas to a personal diet and how they impact environmental concerns. During my literature review, I also wanted to better understand how individual choices could become impacted by the broader context in which they're made, either through policy or environmental factors that contributed to a different outcome. One of the things I noted was how procurement policies can improve some outcomes with unhealthy nutrient intake by helping to limit the options that are available for folks to make their choices within. And then also the combined and passive actions and interventions are more effective when brought together So things like price, placement, education, putting a confluence of items together can have a bigger impact than just using one singular intervention within. And I also wanted to note how there were barriers that might also stand in the way of young men who were wanting to participate. And the barriers that I noted were the way that stigma and guilt reduce willingness and seeking food resources or participating in food literacy research. Now, time cost and misaligned skills were also something that was noted for being able to act as a barrier within the framework of food literacy and accumulating that kind of a knowledge. So that brings me back to my research question. And that again is, how do masculinity norms shape the guilt responses of young men when they are asked to participate in sustainability focused food literacy research? I've already given kind of a clue on what population I'm looking for. I'm hoping to target early adult males between the ages of 18 and 30 that are assigned male when they were born. And the way that I'm going to target this population is by using a convenience sample. I was seeking about 20 participants or more if I got them, but I only ended up with 13 usable respondents throughout the study, and largely only about 12 that answered throughout most of the other question types beyond the descriptive and the qualitative questions that were open-ended. So the survey design helped me to frame the structure of the study around the questions that I was hoping to have answered, and that was how masculinity impacts attitudes. So firstly, I understood that we would want to get informed consent from the individuals who were participating, and sex assignment was going to be an important qualifier for whether or not they fit into the group that we were trying to assess. Demographics also helped us to suss out the individuals who were within the age group that we were trying to target. And then open-ended questions helped produce some qualitative data that we could code for themes and then discover a little bit more about those folks. Behavior questions helped to assess what actions they took on a regular basis, and while attitude questions helped expose the feelings and beliefs that those people have around the topics of masculinity and food. And knowledge helped to expose the actual understanding that those individuals had of the concepts that we were asking them of. And so a masculinity cue was presented in the form of a sports video, and then we repeated the attitude questions to see if there was an influence on the way they answered those questions that second time after the cue. So for the question types, there were 3 demographic questions, there were 2 discussion style open-ended questions, 6 behavior questions, and then the Likert style items were attitude questions that assessed both pre and post intervention attitudes to see whether or not those individuals had a change in the way that they thought about things, and then the knowledge questions. And so face validity helped to explain how this study is oriented toward the actual concepts that we're trying to reveal: guilt, stigma, willingness, and food literacy. So whether or not my questions target those specific concepts. And I think reviewing the questions, it points to a clear direction of yes. And then for content validity, these are how the food literacy concepts are connected to the literature that was revealed during the literature review. So the content validity is how well I based my questions out of the content that I found during that literature review, which I used to inform the framing of those questions and and the way that the individuals would approach them. So the study that I created is intended to be descriptive, quantitative, and non-experimental in its design. It was data that was collected over the 3 weeks in March and 2026 during our spring semester here at EIU using Qualtrics. The participants watched a video that was 3 to 4 minutes long. It had a men's sports video in it, and it was intended to activate that masculinity cue, so that way I could assess attitudes before and after. The ethical considerations that were made during the survey's design sought to offer informed consent and produce anonymity and confidentiality to the answers that the participants gave. In order to succeed at this, I used password protected files and no identifiers on the individuals who answered the questions. So for the study, I used data analysis to help summarize the answers that were given by the respondents. And so the frequencies and percentages help explain how often people answered the same or differently, and averages and standard deviations help produce the median answer that somebody offered, and how far away from that standard answer the other responses could have been. So the range of those answers is noted in a standard deviation. And to test whether masculinity cues influenced attitudes, I used an independent samples t-test, which helped me to compare pre and post video Likert responses to those attitude measurements. So the findings produced 13 final male respondents that were qualified to be in the study, and that they were assigned male at birth and that they were within that age range that I was looking for, between 18 and 30. There was a majority of them who were white, but there were more racial and ethnic identities that were revealed during the study's findings, and show that there's a broad range of individuals that were available to answer the questions. For knowledge questions, 25 to 33% incorrectly answered basic food literacy items. So these were questions like which item has the most dietary fiber, whether or not frozen or fresh vegetables have a better nutrient content, and what is the calorie content of a gram of fat. And so individuals, at least 25% of the time, were working with information that did not offer them the opportunity to have the highest level of food literacy understanding during the questions in the rest of the survey. So for my findings during the attitude questions, both pre and post answers were used weighted responses, so that way I could find out what the mean measurement was, what the average response was, and then it would exist on the scale of all of the answers, and finding that associated average response. So after the masculinity cue, that response didn't change very much. All of the p-values were greater than 0.05, and when that shows that there's no significant change that was made during the responses that were given afterward. For behavior questions, there was a wide range in frequency for weekly home prepared meals, between 2 to 23 meals per week. The average is 8.5 meals, and there was a standard deviation of 6.56, showing that larger range. And there were a lower frequency of plant-based meals, local produce considered, and sometimes, on average, preference for medium and large portions. So my study produced 3 different conclusions. The first was that masculinity-related guilt did not affect participation. This is shown in the fact that no significant differences were produced between the pre and post cue attitudes, and shown through the t-values, which ranged from 0.9 to 1.91, and that the p-values were all greater than 0.05. Masculinity perceptions remain stable despite the cue, and it supports the null hypothesis that guilt did not inhibit participation. The second conclusion I was able to make was that the participants were not always knowledgeable in the food literacy concepts that were offered. Participants were only able to answer questions right 77 to 66% of the time correctly. And the other 25 to 33% of the time, the individuals didn't have the knowledge of the food literacy concepts they were tested for. So that shows that only 75% were able to identify the highest fiber food correctly, and only 66% knew the caloric value of fat. And this indicates a disconnection between the knowledge and the values and the behaviors, and not guilt. So this doesn't show that the hypothesis is correct either. The third conclusion I was able to draw showed that there were no consistent sustainability focused food habits in the individuals in the sample. This was shown in meal preparation, which had such a wide range of 2 to 23 times per week that individuals made meals in their home, and the average was 8.5. And then there was still the protein being a prioritization, while plant-based meals were pretty low. And this shows that their choices weren't sustainability focused. Meanwhile, local foods were only considered in a moderate sense, and not always very frequently amongst all the individuals. And the portion sizes that the sample chose tended to be either medium, with 58% choosing that, or large, 42%, and nobody chose a small meal in the sample population. This shows that sustainability isn't always a primary driver of male food choice behaviors, and it also doesn't support the hypothesis. So during the study, there was definitely some options that kind of revealed themselves to be opportunities to better attune the study towards what we were actually hoping to discover. And firstly, the limitations in the study were that it was a convenient sample, and there was a very small sample size with limited demographic diversity overall. And there was only a brief masculinity cue, and it may not have been strong enough to activate guilt or the feeling of what a normal behavior should be. And then the survey was also flagged as being a little bit long by Qualtrics. So that's a potential spot for attention and fatigue to settle in, and for individuals to not necessarily answer as well as they might have otherwise. So this exposes some opportunities in future research, and that they could choose to use a stronger or a different masculinity cue. They could change the setting, or work with populations that have stronger gender norm impacts that show up in their responses. And then it could also refine the questions so we better capture guilt and sustainability in the behaviors that individuals take. And thank you very much for checking out my video, and for contributing to me in this class by taking the opportunity to question or comment in the discussion post that I provide on D2L. So thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a great end of your semester.